very rich and rewarding. We're going to do something we hope a little bit different today. Normally we have a panel, the panelists speak, and then the audience has questions and comments. What we'd like to do today is start off with passing around, where are they? Here. Is passing around some of these 3x5 cards. And if you would like, why don't you put a few words on there what your thoughts are of what is socialism today, and perhaps also on the back, what's the definition of democracy? And we're going to discuss those things. Our panelists will make some brief presentations, and then we'll have another discussion. So I'm going to just pass these around, if you would. Comments. So why don't we have a little discussion, have everybody read and maybe say a few words regarding what it is that they wrote, what they think about what socialism today is, how it relates to democracy, however, and then we'll have a couple of comments here from our panelists, and then we'll have some more discussion. I have a microphone here for those we think may need it. You can pass it around. So in no particular order, maybe we'll start here and go around with their thoughts.
Good morning. Nice to see you all. Fair and equal labor rights for all and no bosses. Everyone's a boss for socialism. Democracy, freedom, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness for all.
I mean, democracy and socialism are pretty much all the same. However, the difference is that for me, socialism is a lifestyle. Democracy is the way in which we obtain it through checks and balances and diplomacy.
We can't hear you down here.
Yeah,
Oh.
put the microphone a little closer to your mouth.
Oh, boy. Not a rock star. Socialism for me is basically one and the same. The only thing that's different about it is democracy is checks and balances. Socialism for me is a lifestyle.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
That's it.
I'm doing okay with the mic? Okay, I'm not going to make a big distinction between socialism and democracy either. But I think a just society has to have a distributive dimension that Roosevelt talked about. It would involve collective organization, participatory decision-making. I think if I place the emphasis on today, then for me, important elements include sustainable practices, balance, harmony, getting beyond the individualistic ideology of neoliberal thinking, but above all, I think, and a recognition that everything's interconnected. But within all that, I think that different people's communities and societies have to determine their own form of organization, bottom up, and that there might be multiple forms of social organization that a just society could take, so long as there's awareness of interconnectedness with the planet, with other communities, and the like.
I agree. I'll just add that socialism is, at a minimum, and perhaps maximum, moving beyond capitalism. And we know what capitalism is, we don't know what socialism is. And capitalism is individual ownership of the means of production by absentee shareholders, for the most part. Democracy is rule by all the people in any given context, one person, one vote, so that if you extend democracy to workplaces, which are currently autocratic dictatorships, it would be, you'd run the workplace, one person, one vote.
You wrote all that?
Two. What's that? Did that get across?
Yes.
Oh,
Did you finish?
I did.
Okay.
Democracy for me is freedom of expression, freedom to do good things for me and my community, is growing in freedom. In socialism, I don't have very exactly idea what is this, is because I am here for understand. Thank you.
Okay, for democracy, I agree with
Put the
everything.
microphone close to your mouth.
Not
too close.
I agree with everything everybody has said. I wrote, democracy is a group of people governed consensually by a small group which has been selected by voting with checks and balances and consists of the freedoms that people need. Socialism is an idea. I also like what she said is a lifestyle. I like that. Whereby all may live peacefully and productively to satisfy the needs of all, including the earth and the animals and all that's involved with it, the entirety.
Okay, here's what I wrote. Socialism means a lot of things, but to me, an economic system designed to guarantee a fair and satisfying life to all in the world. Democracy, a system whereby uninformed voters make decisions which profoundly affect the human condition, and it is often gained.
I wrote a question on socialism rather than defining socialism, but I would define socialism as a system for the people that guarantees or at least guarantees free access to the basics like health, education, fair work, adequate work for an adequate income. What else were the other basics? Transportation, public transportation, air, water, things that are just basic things, basic services that will foster a healthy society. For democracy, I wrote this definition as a system based on a vision or promise of equality, justice, liberty for all, with and through public participation or representation, but it's always changing and adjusting to given situations, but the promise and the vision remains.
Not for me. Go ahead.
I pass.
Socialism, to me, would be where we had more cooperative movements, businesses controlled by basically cooperatives, with the workers voting for their electors, etc. And democracy would be where democracy extends to the working place. So workers would have individual rights to do their business, let's say limit top salaries, things like that.
Behind you.
Well, just to add some ideas. Well, I don't think at this point it's necessary to make a definition. So I would like to call your attention to the fact that in order to change things, one important thing is to dislocate the the anthropocentrismo, I don't know how to say it in English, the anthropocentrismo
No.
is not at the center. To dislocate ourselves as human species at the center of every consideration. To put the means of making life possible for everybody at the center of our discussion. So, besides that, the improvements have to come from bottom up. We live in a context of neighbors, with families. So I think the improvement has to come from bottom up.
I think I'm going to be, excuse me, contrarian. Socialism to me means governmental funding of institutions for the people, resulting in higher taxes. But that said, I think the upper 1% should definitely be paying more, maybe even the top 5%. And because obviously things are not getting done like infrastructure, and I do believe that indigent people should have the right to live well, and in this country I don't think they do. Democracy, excuse me, a system in which people are free to express their opinions, and institutions probably should receive more money, such as cultural institutions. Right now it's mostly run by private donors. I think there's freedom of the press. And governmental agencies should be allowed to exist independently without meddling, and of course, a system of checks and balances.
Democracy for me is the oldest definition of distributing of the power from autocratic people to the people. And the government is then being run by representatives of the people. Socialism, let me preface, I grew up about 30 miles from the Berlin Wall. We studied socialism, communism, democracy extensively when I grew up. I've seen socialism work in the Eastern European countries until the collapse. Means didn't work. I've seen socialism, communism work in Russia and in China until it didn't work. I've seen capitalism work in lifting 3 billion people out of poverty into the middle class. So, banning capitalism is not the right thing. The issue for me with socialism and communism, the way it was tried with Marx and Lenin from the very beginning, didn't work either. So the way you have to, for me, the way into the future is a way of socialism, democratic mixture as we find it in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and in parts of Northern Europe, where the people are the most happy, where wealth is distributed, but where you don't have a distribution of power to all people and everybody votes of where we go into the future.
What is your name?
My name is Attila. It's a nice Hungarian.
Mine are questions. I have the impression that expats and people in the United States are not clear, and I know that I am not clear, on whether or not socialism is a system of government or a system of economics. To me, those are two different things. I don't mean that they aren't linked in some ways. It is my understanding that democracy is a philosophy of government. I need answers to those two things.
I agree. Those are good questions. What I would like to know is how you would define communism as opposed to socialism. Is it just socialism from the top down, as in the communist countries that we see? as opposed to from the bottom up? And have you ever had a communist country that worked from the bottom up? That's kind of one question. And then I look at capitalism, and it really isn't from the bottom up, whatever they say about democracy in America, it's just from the top down. So it does seem that they both get more and more like each other, and less attractive, and what can be done about it.
Yeah, just briefly, I think socialism is a system, an economic system, and a social system that works for everyone, not just the top isolated corporate people. And the idea of the power coming from the bottom, that is a very important aspect of socialism for me.
Behind you.
Okay, I believe that socialism and what we have is a system where we have capitalism with a little bit of socialism. That capitalism is predominant when it's definitely top down. What we need is a governing system, and I think it does include economic and political, and we need to be much more focused on a system which is both primarily socialist with democratic principles.
Well, socialism and democracy are both systems, they're both ideals, they're both still concepts, and we've seen them tried in places, but that still is not the complete definition for either of those. I think socialism is for the good of the whole, and with an emphasis on the good, and that everyone, all, our whole environment and all people, etc., are included in the whole in socialism. And certainly in America, it's very misunderstood and feared. In democracy, voting matters, and not all, not the whole, have the vote. So, and majority matters. And so it means that it really is not, you know, that all do not participate.
Democracy is the ongoing adventure to disprove the notion that elites, monarchs, fat cats, strongmen, shall govern us masses. Socialism is the quest for healthy interactions between the widest and most diverse of groups, so there is a common or shared resistance to indefensible concentrations of wealth and of poverty.
I think some of these questions that have just been raised are really good ones, and I hope you do discuss them. There's another thing I might add to trying to get a definition of socialism, because like Attila, I've tried to visit many communist countries, always seeking for a successful one, and where people don't complain about a lack of liberty, individual liberty. And I haven't yet found one that I could believe in, and I feel, of course, living in the United States these days, very apprehensive about the current version of democracy. On the other hand, I grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, feeling it was a more democratic country. There is a way to do it. But I guess my question is, can you apply the principles that we've been talking about that we sort of hope are in socialism to large countries like the United States? It seems to work very well in the Scandinavian countries, but those are small countries. And when we talk about top-down and bottom-up, my impression in the United States is you're never going to get a majority to vote. This is sort of, maybe with a different system you can hope that they would, but I'm not sure they will. I think a lot of people prefer that things are decided for them. And then they maybe cling to smaller institutions like their churches or their library groups or their local government. But I'm apprehensive at the thought that what you wish for as a bottom-up system might not apply in very large countries, because that's what seems to have happened. So realistically, one's hope is, as in Scandinavia, that there is, and it's also complicated by capitalism, because I don't know of a socialistic country that works without a capitalistic component. Capitalism has certainly raised standards of living as well as socialism, and there are a lot of good things that happen, but it seems like there has to be maybe a balance between the economics and the socialism of having government participation in the system. And so it's a question of what kind of compromises do we have to make to get that. But I do want to my main point is that I don't think bottom-up would work necessarily in the United States.
Well, if my relatives from small town Texas were here, they would say socialism is anti-Christian communism without freedom. Anyway, they live in both small towns, but socialism to me is sharing resources for all. And when I just try to talk with them, I talk about democratic socialist countries, and I give them examples of positive things. For democracy, I just said it was participatory government where everyone has a vote.
For democracy, I have governance by the decision-making of the majority of people affected. For socialism, cooperative and democratic system following destruction of the system whereby productive decisions are made and social relationships are defined by the self-valorization of capital.
Well, there have been a lot of very good comments and questions. I'm just going to add a couple of little thoughts myself. One of the things about socialism, for me, is the creation of an educated, participatory citizenship, or citizenry, pardon me. And that, to me, would be one of the goals that we would try to look for. How we achieve that is also very difficult, and that's a long discussion, but an important one. And the second part of that is also so many of us have felt in our lives, and today still feel in our lives, alienated from what it is that we do. Either the work that we're doing every day, for most people, they go into work with a kind of weight on their shoulders, and they feel that sense of distance from what it is that they're doing, because they don't feel that participation, they don't feel that this is a creation of their own. And one of the things of socialism would try to be to remove that feeling of alienation, because people would be participating both in workplace democracy and decision-making about what's to be produced and why, and informed discussions about major things such as the environmental challenge. As to democracy, for me again, I don't think one can disentangle democracy from socialism. I see that democracy or representative democracy has worked only in a very limited fashion, given the power relations and the relationship of money to everything within capitalism. And it's working less and less. And people are becoming more and more thrown out of making decisions, either by doing it themselves because they feel there's no point in it, because they feel that alienation from society, from their neighbors and so forth, and they're uninformed. So democracy, I think, will flourish in a kind of socialism that I would like to see. And again, it's something that's a creation. I don't think that you could just say, well, this is socialism and this is what it is. It's something that all of us who are going to work toward it, and the younger people who will do it and struggle, in that struggle, they will come up with the ideas of what it is and what the relationships between people are going to be. And that's very important. That process of creation is very, very important. That's my 2 cents. So now I'll turn it over to the panelists.
Well, before we get into a more formal presentation, I'd just like to make a comment and observation on some of the things that have been said as we went around the room. For one thing, I think we need to be clear that what we saw in the 20th century and was called socialism or communism was an experiment in trying to create an ideal. It was based upon the state ownership of the means of production and planning and management of the economy, presumably for the benefit of all. Now, that state socialism was very effective in being able to mobilize the society's resources for great undertakings, like industrializing the Soviet Union, like defeating Nazism in World War II, and also providing, many of the social benefits like health care, education, etc., for the whole population. But it did not succeed in doing one of the things that I heard so many of you saying as the ideal of socialism, namely creating a society in which people can participate and have a feeling that their needs are being met. A society where people are not alienated from their labor or alienated from the larger governance of the society. And because of those failures, and it also turned out that state socialism on the Soviet model was not sustainable. It eventually collapsed for a number of reasons. But it's because of that now in the 21st century, many advocates of socialism are looking for a different approach, a more bottom-up approach, as many of you said, a more participatory approach, an approach that still, nevertheless, recognizes our interdependence as members of a society and the need to have institutions that provide for the common good and the well-being of all. And some of those ideas are what I will want to talk about later, but I'm glad to hear that that was a theme that so many of you expressed.
Could I suggest you hold the mic just a little bit further away? Because there's a lot of feedback to any of the...
Okay, that's what I want to say at this moment. I'll come back after Betsy.
A lot of you are asking for, is socialism a
governmental system and economic system, democracy, government, economic. Both of these concepts have long histories, and they were born in, well, democracy was born, in ancient Greece, but that was a slave-based society. Socialism was born throughout, the idea was born throughout the 19th century among utopian thinkers in France and England. So these are ideas that have a long history and have been expressed different precise ideas. It was Montesquieu in the 18th century who came up with the idea of a balance of powers, one of the Enlightenment thinkers. And democracy, well, is it democracy for everyone, or is it only for white men? The founding fathers of the United States thought that democracy was only for land-holding white men. So we have to understand the historical development and how these notions have grown and changed over the centuries. One thing that I think is precisely very important, and I tend to think more in terms of the urgency of now. Someone mentioned where people are happy. To me, socialism is a world where people are happy. I mean, what an odd idea. Most people go through life, well, first of all, we're mostly traumatized by either living under bombs that are falling on us, or the effect of bombs having fallen 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago. So we're going through life wounded to start with. Most people are scared. They are so scared. I mean, you can see it in their eyes. I remember being in Moscow in the early 90s, and people were petrified. Socialism would be a world where people are not afraid that they're going to be thrown into the street, lose their home, die of some truck hits them and they die because they don't have any health insurance to be cared for in a hospital. We have the resources to fulfill all of the needs of everyone on the planet. And I think looking at it from the perspective of, what will make for more happiness. That's the one thing that we're, as human beings, we are capable of feeling, is happiness and love. I think my cats are too, but,
And our dogs.
Or dogs, yes. That's something that is so sorely lacking. As a child in the 50s and 60s, it seemed like more people were happy. Maybe I'm living a delusional life, but
There was poverty, there was bad poverty, but you're right.
there was poverty, but it wasn't.
It was bad poverty, but you're right overall.
People were not treated as though they were subhuman because they were poor. I grew up with coal miners in Appalachia and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the coal miners, they were, they didn't have a great life, but they weren't, they didn't have bombs falling on them, and they weren't as miserable and insecure as I see people today. So for me, one of the main aspects of socialism would be that it allows for happiness and human flourishing and further education.
What is your name?
Betsy Bowman.
Betsy.
Oh, you forgot to introduce us, Gregory. I'm Betsy Bowman.
This is Cliff DuRand, and with Bob Stone next to you, we're the founders of the Center for Global Justice. And the first talk that we gave on this, on neoliberalism anyway, was in March of 2004. So we've been talking about this for a long time. Hopefully we're getting to some answers.
But allow me to say something about happiness. When I grew up, we were happy. We were happy because everybody had nothing. We were all the same. And there was nothing out there. Everybody knew that we were all the same, and therefore there was nothing in there that brought us into envy or something like this. At the very same time, we were very unhappy. We were very unhappy because we couldn't realize our possibilities. We couldn't realize what we thought would be the right development for the individual. We couldn't do that. So for me, the forum that will succeed, and I think that has partly or mostly succeeded in Northern Europe, is a combination of that you have a relative equality of wealth, and you have the freedom of individual development. I still say today, under socialism, we wouldn't have an iPhone. We wouldn't have great inventions of technology because, it is a bottom-up thing, and it, from my experience, didn't work. You need people that have visions, and these visions have to get the opportunity to be developed.
Attila, is that East Germany or West Germany?
I grew up in West Germany.
West Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say a word about happiness. International polling has shown that the country in the world where people are happiest is Mexico. Mexico ranks #1. In spite of the fact that up to 80% of the population is in poverty, in spite of the corruption that is so rampant at all levels of the society, their happiness comes from the fact that their lives are very oriented toward their family. It is having meaningful social relations, whether it be at the level of a family or a larger community, or ideally in the society as a whole, that can be the basis of happiness. And what, insofar as socialism aims at promoting happiness, it is by the last of those means. That is, by creating a larger human community that will be meaningful in people's lives. Just because Mexicans find happiness in their small community of the family doesn't make them socialists. But it does at least help point in the direction of a value that socialism hopefully aims for at the societal scale.
I don't think I used this very effectively.
You want to do your presentation.
Yes. And this is just to point out some contradictions in all of these nice beliefs about happiness. When the problems in Northern Ireland were going on and people were being shot in the streets and all of this, they kept discovering when they did surveys of the British Isles that Northern Ireland was the happiest place and people were the most creative. All the way through the Troubles, they were being creative and happy. So don't ask me why, but that's what we discovered. Maybe it's purpose of some sort.
It just strikes me. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. It strikes me that my experience with socialism, bottom-up socialism, comes from just very brief contact. I was living in Canada during most of this time, but with Chile and with Nicaragua and with El Salvador and with Venezuela, a little bit Cuba, And in all those cases, I feel it's one of the great, most meaningful aspects of my life that I have known people living in those circumstances because they were happy. And in all those circumstances, I don't want to offend anybody, but the U.S. came in and destroyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to hear from Betsy as a few prepared remarks, and she's going to share them with us.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of put this whole discussion into historical context, and then a context of my own reading over and observations over the last 50 years. Socialism will be what we make of it. Marx said very little about it, actually. He was primarily a critic of capitalism. I don't think that socialism has ever existed, despite all many attempts at it. And we have no agreed on blueprint, recipe, or model for it. You know, what we do have is 200 years or so of fervent struggles and writings. But all of these presume no more that we can go beyond capitalism. You know, the evolution is supposed to be from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and then to communism. Well, living as we do under capitalism, socialism will be the result of how we change capitalism, should we choose to change it in a way that benefits everyday people. In short, you know, it's up to us what we make it. And what I have learned from my studies is that first, the Enlightenment revolutions in countries such as France, the UK, and the US, which sought liberation from feudalism's inherited and unalterable class rankings, and toward goals such as the motto of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, which would assure citizens, as it says in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, especially with decision-making by means of democracy. And a second thing that I learned is that the instrument by which material needs were to be met, capitalism, I mean, that's what the French Revolution was all about, to get rid of the control, the absolute control by the monarchy and the church and the feudal system. They wanted to introduce capitalism as a way of meeting needs. This has slowly revealed itself as incapable and indeed hostile to achieving those goals, capitalism. The emancipatory struggle of the American French Revolutions of 1776 and 1789 only gradually uncovered capitalism's unsustainability as means to its end. In France in the 19th century, there were a series of many revolutions after the main revolution of 1789, 1830, 1848, 1870. And these revolutions all ended in massacres of workers in the streets by the police and the army. So this is what liberty, equality, and fraternity has come to. You know, massacring workers in the streets, well, yeah. Governments flip-flop between republics, restorations of monarchy, emperors, Napoleon, and they never realized the 18th century Enlightenment project of a society free of domination by the monarchy, aristocracy, and church. The social contract that would unite the republic's equal citizens, of course it turned out to not include women or colonized peoples or brown peoples in Africa, Asia, Haiti, Latin America.
fine print in the U.S. social contract also excludes vast swaths of humanity from the social contract, as I've mentioned. And how did they do this? By slave and wage labor were fair means for growing capitalism. Well, socialism today echoes these Enlightenment goals. It's free, egalitarian society based on brotherhood and democracy is impossible, where capital's needs trump human needs. Capitalism is a society based on benefiting capital. Socialism is a society based on benefiting the needs of society. By using up our environment, capital leaves us little time. We're all very aware of that. There's very little time left. Elites want all of the financial and military power, plus all the oil needed to project that power globally. Obviously, F-35s don't fly on solar power. Threatening oil-rich Iran and Venezuela, elites have to avoid all binding targets for reducing global warming. They have to. Otherwise, they won't have enough gas to run their wars. And they protect their extraction of wealth from countries around the world and from people's very bodies by forcing people to work by the threat of war. No oil, no war. Remember Trump's middle-class tax cuts from a year or two ago? Well, it turns out, Jack Rasmus points out that it's a $4.5 trillion tax cut over 10 years for the top 1%, but it's a $1.5 trillion tax increase over 10 years for the middle class. Protect capital above all, even if global warming threatens the capitalists themselves. So socialism has also been expressed these days, recently with the phrase una vida digna, a life of dignity. And the U.S. economy has, of course, evolved into something that most of us don't want. About half of us live in or near poverty. And think of the new normal. 20 vets commit suicide daily. I mean, this is part of my plea for we've got to do it now. 20 vets commit suicide every day. The U.S. drops a bomb every 7 seconds, every day, 24 hours a day. Immigrants, including children, are put in concentration camps. Why? Well, they're fleeing the unintended consequences of U.S. wars that were fought in their countries of origin 20 to 40 years ago. Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. All of this is normal. Now, if all of this is normal, what do we think human beings are? Do we hate human beings? There are powerful arguments that answer yes, we do. And the contempt with which the governor of Puerto Rico was speaking of the people who died during the Hurricane Maria, brought on by global warming or made worse by global warming, is that our image of what a human being is? No, we reject that answer. Humans are not subhuman. Humans don't hate themselves, or they shouldn't. Well, according to Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, the way we work, the way we literally make ourselves, are projects that are an image of what humanity is for us. Capitalist markets are supposed to coordinate our self-seeking desires, but this presumes an odious self-image. Economic sanctions punish those who resist the extraction of wealth from their land and their bodies by US-based multinationals. In this new global colony, discipline is enforced by surveillance from a ubiquitous war machine. If this is normal, is this the kind of world we want? Our world's inexorable trajectory points to the death of all life on the planet. Now, we don't seem to be afraid of that. But boy, we're afraid of a word, socialism. We reject this odious self-image that humanity gives itself today. We have forged and we must own up to that self-image. But together we can construct another. Sartre's basic principle is that we make ourselves for good or for ill. For our part, we'd like to start towards a society that fulfills human needs, not those of elites and capital. We need not just a Green New Deal, but an economic and social New Deal. I'd like to make some suggestions on what that would include. And I know there will be a lot of objection to, oh, this is not politically feasible, we'll never be able to do this. Well, the alternative is death. Omicide, ecocide. So, public banks with participatory decision-making on investment, which would include expropriating the $32 trillion that has been hoarded in offshore bank accounts, expropriating the $2 trillion in onshore banks, and the $2 trillion that are hoarded by corporations. They're not using them to invest or anything else. Free quality health care for all with nurse, patient, and doctor self-management. Imagine, nurses running the hospital. Free quality education for all, with teachers and student self-management. A universal basic income to power adult education and automation or elimination of boring, monotonous jobs. How many people do your children and grandchildren have boring, monotonous jobs? I bet a lot of you do. No military, no wars. You know, socialism would mean peace. No one mentioned that. But socialism could mean peace. No wars, no special operations, no foreign bases. We have 1,000 around the world. We need peace. Participatory budgeting involving citizens at all levels for all government expenditures. A lot of this just restates what you all have already said. Participatory decision-making for all utilities. Do we want a nuclear power plant or solar panels? Transportation, agriculture, water systems, worker ownership and management of enterprises while abolishing boards of directors and absentee share ownership. And we need another civilian conservation corps managed by the workers to clean up the messes that have been made all over the world. So, what are our options today? We either have renewal and change and peace in these directions, or we're going to have a nuclear or ecological catastrophe. I choose the former, and that is our joint socialist invention of a human world made by us. Please join me.
I want to talk not about socialism, but socialist. Socialism refers to a system, an integrated system of institutions. Socialist refers to the character of institutions. You can have socialist institutions are the building blocks for socialism as a system. But you can have socialist institutions even in a capitalist society. And so the first point I want to make is to point out that we have socialist institutions in the United States, for example. As a youth, I went to a public school, and then I went to a public university. Are those socialist institutions? I would say they are. There are many who say they are not. But that's because they're thinking of socialism as a system. Last spring, my wife and I went to the States to take advantage of socialized medicine, Medicare. It's a socialism of the healthcare system for those of a certain age. And what is now under discussion is the possibility of extending that to the entire population. Medicare for all. That's a healthcare system that has been socialized in an inclusive way. Is Social Security socialist?
Yes.
When Roosevelt first proposed it, he was attacked for advocating socialism.
Yeah.
But Social Security, is not socialism. It is a socialized retirement system through which working people, through their contributions during their work life, contribute toward a retirement system for all. That's a socialized institution, it seems to me. How about Yellowstone National Park? I maintain that's a socialist institution as well, provided by the federal government for the benefit of all and available to all. Well, here in San Miguel, how about the Jardín? That's a socialized space where we come together for sociability, and it's available to all to use that public space. How about our aquifer? The water that we all depend upon for life. That belongs to everyone, is available to all. That is a socialized natural resource that is often privatized, but in principle, it is public. How about the internet? I would say it too is a socialized institution, a socialist institution. How about unions? Unions are often attacked by the right as socialist. Well, I would say that they are, insofar as unions represent an institution through which working people can collectively have some power over their lives. And there may be better ways, like cooperatives, which I will get onto in a moment. But basically, I want, what I've been suggesting is based upon the fact that I find it very useful to think of the commons as the basic idea of socialized institutions. This process of socializing institutions is a kind of reclaiming of commons frequently from capital, which is a reversal of the process by which capitalism grew through its dispossession of commons, enclosing them, privatizing them, and commodifying them so that they can become a source of profit. It did this not only in what Marx called primitive accumulation, but continues to do so throughout its history up to the present, as David Harvey has argued. Constructing socialism can then be conceived of as a reversal of that capitalizing process, as a reclaiming of commons, a socializing of those resources that are useful to human development. Of the resources that contribute to human flourishing, there are some that can do so best when held in common. Not all, but some certainly. Institutions are social when they point to human development through the commons. Now, commons are shared resources held by a community, governed democratically, and available for use by members of the community. These shared resources are not only land and public spaces, but also the air we breathe and the water we drink, public health facilities, the internet, accumulated human knowledge and culture, and a host of other resources available to all that can enrich our lives. Capital seeks to privatize these commons so as to profit from them, as we can see wherever neoliberalism has been rampant. Socializing them reclaims them as our common wealth, available to all and for the benefit of all. It is because capital threatens to enclose commons that to protect them it is necessary to break the power of capital by also socializing the means of production. Since a commons is held in common by a community, it is managed by that community so as to assure access and sustainability. Whether the rules by which it is governed are customary or are enacted laws and regulations, they issue from a participatory process to which the commoners consent, and in that way is democratic. How is the democratic governance of a commons possible? By democracy, we understand the possibility of joint decision-making for collective action for a common good. Democracy depends on a collective agency, and that requires a collective identity. That is, the commons, the commoners, must identify themselves as a community sharing the common resource, and thus feel a commitment to its proper governance for the common good. This is the foundation of a democratic governance of the commons. These are precisely the conditions that obtain in a worker cooperative. There is an awareness of a shared interest in the success of the collective project because of the interdependence experienced daily in the workplace. All for one and one for all is a lived reality. The institutional structure of the cooperative engenders a social consciousness, a socialist consciousness. A cooperative is basically a labor commons in which the members pool their labor in a common good. In a capitalist workplace, labor is also pooled, but under the domination of the capitalist and for his benefit. In a cooperative, the labor commoners govern their own collective efforts for their common good. But the socialization of labor aims to also take into account a larger common good, that of the community. The socialization of labor in a cooperative is important in the socialist construction because it embeds values of cooperation and commitment to a shared well-being in daily work life, thereby fostering a social consciousness, a socialist consciousness. Cooperatives are little schools of socialism. This governance can take place on different levels, depending on the scope of a given commons. The commoners in the workplace are the workers who make up the cooperative. The commoners in a neighborhood are the residents who share a space in the city. The commoners in an urban transportation system are the bus riders, auto drivers, bicycle riders, and pedestrians. And as we are becoming increasingly aware of global climate change, the commoners of our planet are all of humanity, both present and future generations. In each case of these nested commons, it is those who share a common resource and whose lives are affected by it who have the right to participate in its governance. In the first instance, this participatory democracy operates at a local level, at the level closest as possible to the everyday lives of people. Higher levels of decision-making are to support the whole lower levels, and where necessary, can coordinate them. This is the principle of subsidiarity that guides the relations between commoners at different levels. Let me give you an illustration. This last weekend, several of us went up to Dolores Hidalgo to protest a proposed gold mine that threatens to poison the aquifer as well as a good piece of the land. It is vehemently being opposed by the campesinos, and they organized a march this last Sunday. Very impressive demonstration of popular participation, seeking to protect their commons, their common land and their common aquifer. And that we should be aware of here in San Miguel. That's an aquifer that we share in here as well. It is poisoned a half hour north of here, and in Dolores Hidalgo is poisoned here in San Miguel as well. In the first instance, it is those who are the protectors of their common land and aquifer who have the responsibility to govern its use. But we also have a role in it. And one of the difficult questions that has to be faced is that the nation as a whole, Mexico as a whole, has an interest, as is reflected in the fact that the subsoil resources of the nation belong to the government, to the state. But the principle of subsidiarity says that in the first instance, the governance should be at the bottom level, and the top, that is the national government, has a responsibility to support and protect that. That's the principle that has been asserted in many places in Latin America as people have struggled to protect their commons, particularly indigenous people, against predatory gold mining or other mineral extraction or development of fossil fuels. The principle has been adopted in a number of countries of Latin America that such things can go forward only after there's been informed consultation and consent by the local community. Now, I emphasize the participatory democratic character of commons because it is through such participation that the commoners are themselves socialized. That is, they develop the social values, attitudes, and practices that sustain a full human life together, in which all can develop fully. As Marx put it, they realize their species being. Cooperatives are especially effective in educating their members in the values and practices of a participatory socialism. This is more than an invigoration of civil society, it is also construction of a socialist governmentality. This is a system of control that extends into the very subjectivity of the human, into the self. This is what makes a social system self-governing and self-replicating. If a social order is to be sustained over the long run, it needs to be rooted in the character of the people, their values, their sensibilities, their taken for granted understandings, their very subjectivity needs to be consonant with its institutions. The socialist transition is a process that needs a people with a socialist character if it is to continue. To be sure, socialism needs a socialist state, but equally, a socialist state needs a socialist people. There are struggles in the U.S. now to defend our remaining commons from neoliberal privatization, as Betsy suggested. Public education, environmental protection, public lands, the internet, healthcare are all threatened by privatization. These public goods are common resources that enrich our lives. The Trump administration is imposing a veritable tsunami of privatizations in an attempt to complete the destruction of the New Deal and Great Society programs that have been undermined bit by bit over the last 4 decades. Now, as we wake up to the clear and present threat to public goods that have sustained us, we can better appreciate their value to us and demand their expansion. Their privatization would remove them from our collective governance and enrich private interest. Our resistance to their enclosure is a struggle for their socialization. The struggles against neoliberal capitalism in both the North and the South, the global South, are at their core struggles for socialism. As we defend and seek to expand our commons, we are socializing our institutions one by one, although doing it within the context of a still dominant capitalism. That framework will limit how far we can go. Without state power, our gains remain vulnerable, and it is doubtful we can ever overthrow capitalism by their expansion. What then does it mean to socialize an institution? Basically the same as when we speak of socializing a child. As any parent knows, you socialize your child by teaching the child social values and ways of behaving that enable him or her to live harmoniously with others in society. That is, the parent points the development of the child toward a common good. That is the same when you socialize an institution. You point it toward the common good. For example, you socialize the healthcare system by pointing it away from private profit toward the common good of a healthy society. That is, you make the health resources of society a commons available to all. That is socialized medicine. Similarly, you common the resources of the natural environment by making them available to all, while governing them in a way that is sustainable. That's what we do when we set aside land as a park for public enjoyment, or establish regulations to prevent pollution of the air, water, or land. Similarly, you common knowledge resources in public education through a system of schools and libraries. That is socialized education. And one of my favorite socialized institutions is the public library. Similarly, the internet is socialized when it is available in common to all for our shared benefit, insofar as it is privatized and no longer serves the common good, but rather the profit of some. So we socialize the institution of society when we common together to govern a resource that contributes to our collective and individual well-being. And I'll end on that note.
Well, thank you, Cliff and Betsy, for your very informative comments. And I'm sure people must have some comments of their own that they'd like to make. So, sure.
Pass the contents.
You got it? I guess I want to speak as sort of biased here, because what I feel here is there's no cons in here. I'm from New York.
I have to really think of hope for myself to not, scream.
And the feeling I get here, and it's not intellectual, we're discussing all this linear stuff. And I'm from New York City, where all my friends are dead from drugs. It was like living in a war zone in Spanish Harlem and East Harlem. All my friends are dead from Vietnam, drugs, jail, you name it, AIDS. And until I met some Jews in New York City about the Torah, there was something about how do you survive after 400 years or 4,000 years after the Pharaoh and still have something in here that you can make that tradition last, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism. There is something about happiness in the middle of chaos that has allowed these, not all because religion has been a mess, but there's something about feeling something in here that you cannot describe in words. And that is happening because whether you can go to the Baal Shem Tov and dancing for life, or Jesus and the Good Samaritan, or not cursing your enemy and loving him. Those things are right here from Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad probably, but it's been corrupted somehow. And I don't feel this here. If what we feel here, it'd be a nice way to go. But I was sharing with someone that not all people want a common ground. They hate and they want to kill. I have to agree with you, Betsy. People may want to kill more of us, and those I'm meaning more people of color, because certain groups have the control. It's still going on, whether it's Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Iraq, Iran. So there is something that one can feel if you remain intensely observant of the people around you. Because there are a lot of con people, a lot of crooks still around trying to pick your pockets. Thank you.
I just want to make a couple of points. I do agree that there are too many people in the United States with too much money. Hedge fund managers, failed CEOs leaving with, hundreds of thousands and more millions of dollars, although they've done a rotten job trying to lead a company. But on the other hand, where does most innovation in the world come from? And I would say it was the U.S. The other thing I wanted to point out was about socialism. To me, socialism the institutions under socialism become less, I would say, I think they've become mediocre. I've seen the universities in Europe with many, many thousands of kids who have no access to their professors. They if you're left on your own, if you're not a self-starter, you can keep going to school because you don't have to pay for it. But basically, I think compared to American education, I can't say it because I never attended school there, so maybe I'm out of line here. But I know there are plenty of bad United States institutions, but I do believe that socialism leads to mediocrity in cases. And as far as healthcare is concerned, I agree that the United States should provide health care for all. But when you look at, I mean, this is almost a hackneyed observation. Canada and England, you hear that they have a national health care system, but if you want a knee replacement or something like that, you're put on a list, and I don't know how long it takes for you to get that procedure done. So those are just my observations, and I realize there's a lot wrong with capitalism such as it is in the United States.
I appreciate Betsy's presentation in a sense of, I think, demonstrating the urgency of the situation we're in and the overwhelming scale of destruction that's going on right now in the world. It's not necessarily new, but accelerated. And I think it's partly due to innovations. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. Capitalist innovations that just are relentless in serving capital, and maybe incidentally some people, but it's just incredibly destructive. And my concern is, I mean, we've heard a lot of good sentiments and values and everything. People here have done some really good things, I know. But the problem is, if you look at basically the alternative to a decision-making process that globally is controlled by what enhances capital. Every single decision, all top-down social relationships defined on what can enhance the value of capital, is such an overwhelming power that's entrenched, and we have a very emergency kind of situation. I see what a lot of people have been talking about here is kind of social democracy is something that's always corrupted by, if you leave the capitalist structure in place, it always corrupts. I've worked a lot with cooperatives. I'm a little bit of a student of cooperatives. They always get corrupted. Where I'm from, in Austin, Texas, we have a very nice, successful, economically successful long-term food cooperative. The manager gets paid $125,000 a year. The worker gets paid $30,000 a year, and it operates very much in terms of the capitalist system. And he was just exposed for producing this like racist video, you know, online. So the system of capitalism is so corrupting. I don't see how any kind of reform effort can work, especially in the short run, as something that's been needed. Yet at the same time, if you look at aggressive revolutionary attempts to create meaningful socialism that actually challenges the whole capitalist conception of decision-making based on enhancing the value of capital, you get met with such an overwhelming degree of violence that it completely distorts whatever socialist efforts are being made, whether it militarizes things, whether you get somebody like Mao or Stalin surviving and leaders, because they're the toughest ones that can withstand all this tremendous violence that's being thrown their way. So I'm looking for answers to those kind of questions that nobody here seems to be addressing, and the only speculation I can do is that things are so crazed and so accelerated at the top-down global situation now that there's going to be a collapse, and that maybe in the collapse of capitalism through its own weight, there may be some opportunities for bottom-up creation.
Want other people have a chance to run this book? No.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead. All right, I have so many questions. I hope I keep them straight in the head. Before I go into it, my overriding question, Cliff, because I thought you made a very moving presentation, is whether you think there's a place for capitalism in your hope for the future. Because I think a lot of things have been brought up here that make me really question whether you can have a wholly non-capitalistic society. And the only surviving socialistic examples that we all admire seem to be partly capitalistic. So, but let me just say this about what I call the vampire principle. My family was very involved in the Russian Revolution. They were idealistic, they were Latvian, they went to Russia to join Lenin in the fight for communism, which was then a very idealistic form of socialism. One became the deputy minister of the Russian Bank, one became a commissar in the Urals, one became the deputy minister of culture and was sent to Berlin as a journalist, and that is how my mother came to Berlin and met my father, and they met in the underground. They had a very interesting career that experienced a great many of the 20th century movements. I'm colored by that, and I'm cynical. I'm also a New Yorker, and I'm also a journalist, so it's really a question of show me. I have yet to see the evidence that the pure socialism you're describing, particularly Betsy, is more than an idealistic hope. And I also think there is this vampire principle in all these societies my parents experienced, where the strongest, most dangerous people grab power. And we are now experiencing that in the United States. Fortunately, by a very stupid man who has sort of the same faults that Nixon had, and that brought him down. And after that, we all thought, imagine if he was less paranoid and less, and more intelligent about what he was trying to do to gain power. One day that person will come. And it really doesn't matter what system you live in. Those people exist, as you were talking about, you know, the vampires. So I think I'm very troubled by sitting here and listening to the hopeful but idealism, because I feel it's begging to be destroyed by those vampires. And that is why I asked you, Cliff, why you don't seem to tolerate capitalism, because I think some of these arguments made about industry, creation, stimulation, invention are also a part of capitalism. And I grew up under the Roosevelt, I was very little, but under the Roosevelt administration, and until 1980 and the Reagans, following the Powell Amendment and a plan to destroy everything that had been created under Roosevelt, which they seem to have succeeded to do. We thought of government as a good entity, right? And that was a capitalistic system. And in that system, my belief was, and in many ways it's been borne out, it grows. If it hadn't been taken over by a really dedicated right-wing group, I hate using the word conspiracy, but there was a plan, right? So we have accomplished a great many things in the United States. And in fact, Betsy, what you're deploring is really the United States doing. It is not describing a lot of Europe or Canada. In Canada, people think more in wheat, though it is a Canadian company, that's a gold mining company, isn't it? And that's been true in Chiapas, and you know, so it's not, they're not innocent. But it's basically the United States, and the kind of really, it's what Marx described as a future of capitalism, that it would self-destroy. And we are in that pattern first in the United States. So it is a problem of our government of the last 40 years, because under capitalism, some of these goals that you have as socialists exist. And in many ways, we have liberated women in many ways. We're just on the path. Civil rights are beginning, though we have